Please read your card.
United States Virgin Islands.
Honduras.
Mexico.
Amami Islands.
Puerto Rico.
Philippines.
The Malapas.
French Guiana.
Suriname.
Falkland
Swing Bank.
Liberia.
French Polynesia.
Marcos Island.
Anybody in the back?
Roncator Bank.
Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands.
Cuba.
Colombia.
Kiribati.
Guam. Swan Islands.
Nicumaru.
Phoenix Islands.
Egypt, Palestine, Cambodia, and world.
Own.
What do we own?
Whom do we own?
Own. Drone.
Drone. Drone. On
And
and
on
on
and
and on and
endless.
on. Endless. Abandon.
What you own.
And own up to it.
Our wars.
Own.
Own.
Own. Cambodia.
Palestine, Egypt, and world.
Is this the way the world
Ends.
endless?
War, endless war.
Drone. Is this the way the world ends?
Not with a bang.
But a whimper.
She was destroyed.
By and by.
U.S. Marine operators.
Smooth operator.
She of the interval.
Operator. Orator.
Operator.
Perpetrator.
Military
Operation.
operation.
Search and destroy.
She was.
She was.
Was.
Wasteland.
She was. Ishva.
I was.
Was.
What?
Flag of conquest.
Is watermelon time
The European Foundation.
for fortune
Tune.
and modern conquest?
Conquest.
Con mi madre, conquistador,
Is time.
is time chronotopes of modernity,
Temporal brutalities.
time and again.
America's territory.
$8 million.
Absence.
Presence. Facts.
A cry in the middle of the night.
Harsh beating heart.
Heart.
A story.
Again
Again
and
and again
again.
and again.
And the spirits.
The dead.
Some men.
A cry.
White out.
Erasure.
Absence.
A harsh story.
Look at American men.
Killing me softly. Look at American men.
A girl in the foreground.
She was destroyed. Kill isolated villagers. Killing me softly. We see facts. We see but cannot hear. Killing me softly.
The family altar where he pays his respects to the spirits of the dead into thin air.
Into thin air.
We saw the U.S. government.
Kill isolated villagers. Killing me softly with his song.
Killing me softly.
With his song.
Killing me softly with his song, telling my whole life.
Fact.
We see but cannot hear.
Hearsay.
Isolated facts.
Say it again.
I don't want to hear.
We saw it coming. The
The
dead.
dead.
Everywhere.
Dead and dying.
The colony.
Returns in shackles.
Fact.
Every lady should carry an automatic.
Tender violences.
The painted desert.
The painted lady.
The pain.
Fact.
Men love.
The missile's heart. Countdown.
Countdown. Heart of darkness. Ladies.
The heart of the matter.
First missile firing. The heart of the colony.
On fire.
Love like hellfire.
Fact.
We know.
Man-made.
Self-made man.
Made man in his image.
Modern man.
Modern love.
Made prehistory.
In Africa.
The dark continent.
Let there be light.
Empire needs.
Islands of imagination.
Empire needs.
To see the light.
Empire needs.
Violence to light its fire.
Empire needs.
To see its
islands,
islands,
its isolation. Far Eastern.
Obsoletes. First Lady.
Of the National Geographic equally at home with Coolie or Mandarin.
I feel equally at home with a Mandarin orange.
Or my Coolie Shepherd.
Don't we eat dogs?
Immigration.
Violence.
Immolation. Assimilation.
Assimilation.
Foreigner policies.
First order.
First world.
First in command.
First,
Fist.
up your ass.
Fuck yourself.
National pornographic.
Fisting.
The pornography of violence.
Islands of imagination.
Fuck me.
Fuck yourself.
Fuck you.
You say
First fuck.
we need to go to war while you're
Like a
already
virgin.
in one.
Fuck you, Deuteronomy whore.
Eat me.
Doggy style.
Coolie shepherd.
God.
Dog.
Guard dog.
Backdoor diplomacy.
World's watchdog. I am the lady of the First World Order
Ladies first. The conquest.
of South Vietnam.
Annam.
As my country was called during the
During
French colonial period. Means pacified South.
Enemite.
We were called
Edomite.
Sodomite.
Oh, the specific century.
Pacific Rim.
Enemite, sodomite.
Pedagogy pede.
The end of history.
History's end.
Angel of history.
Hysterical. It was the end of the war.
The American Wars.
Say my name.
Namaste.
Love not war.
It's a country, not a war.
Hysterical hippies.
Namaste.
Vietnamaste. Anamaste. Anamite.
Sodomite.
Dynamite. This is the way the world ends.
Not with a bang.
Dynamite.
End of history.
Heads. Heads of state. Head off. Off with the heads.
Dead head.
Countdown. Countdown.
To
To
women.
win. Oriental obscene. Off scene. Mise en scène.
Theater of war.
Robot and family.
Family values.
Family a man.
Head
Head of state.
the family.
Head of state. Countdown.
Countdown.
Man down. Man
Man
down.
down.
Man down.
The name.
Egypt.
Palestine, Cambodia, and world.
Here and abroad.
Countdown.
Man down.
Down with the man.
50 U.S. territories.
Terra firma.
Any other name.
Terror.
Writ large upon the
On
world.
the world.
Facts.
Fact. This is the way that the world ends.
Countdown.
This is the end of empire.
Fiction.
Endless wars.
Faction.
This is the way the world ends.
Not with a bang.
But a whimper.
Thanks. That's gonna be hard to go after. I was telling them that I feel like such a nerd. I just want to like talk about what just happened just now. But there's so many connections with what you all just did and my work, so I won't have time to make those connections obvious in this moment. But I'm gonna hopefully it will become clear. So I'm gonna read my talk because I just do that. So forgive me for being more formal with the reading. So preparing for this presentation this past week, I was struck once again with the material realities of the bodies that we live in. Fear of the coronavirus outbreak has fueled racism against Asians, both here and other Western countries, revealing the xenophobia and white supremacist sentiments that underpin such fear. The history of the Asian other as an exotic foreign threat has always undergirded hegemonic attitudes in this nation. And right now, with an elected fascist in power, violent white nationalists and racists are emboldened, legitimizing white supremacy in an administration now controlled by a contemporary Republican Party, whose mainstream power is fueled by white racial resentment. It is both fear but yet desire of the body, the racialized body, that drives violence. We are living in times of unimaginable violence because the violences that we experience are both everyday but also inevitable, marked by temporal immediacy but also temporal delay, a kind of suspended space in which bodies are socially, culturally, and politically matrixed, dependent on regimes of the visible. In other words, how we see what we can see, how bodies and also voices become legible, is dependent on historical practices of constructing knowledge and truth vis-a-vis museum institutions and media institutions, which embeds our collective memories. So I'm starting off with this very, very old image that I made a long time ago, and it's a gelatin silver print that's made from rephotographed photographs from Time and Life and like National Geographic magazines from the 1960s and 70s, combined with family photographs of my own from my own archive. I had been collecting these magazines since I was in high school during my regular scouting sprees at thrift stores, and I was compelled by these stories in these magazines representations of Vietnamese, people who were me but not me. And so I understood from a young age the paradox of the refugee. I am an enemy, I am not an enemy. I am to be killed, I am to be saved. Here's another one. The text is a copy actually from Northwest Airlines, which of course in the context of a magazine filled with photographic stories depicting Vietnamese bodies circumscribed by violence, suggests quite overtly the sexualized Asian body, the conquered Asian body, both of which are one and the same. So I'm going to start by showing a very short clip from a body of work called Adaptation Fever. And oops, it's a video piece that has 4 discrete videos. Each of them different lengths. The total length of all 4 of them together is about 20 minutes, and all the videos are constructed entirely from archival footage that was taken before 1954.
Sự đau khổ thật là to lớn. Sự đau khổ đang bảo tồn cuộc sống của tôi. Sự đau khổ làm anh ngạt thở và cái đó bóp nghẹt tôi.
Je ne peux pas penser à mon enfance sans penser à l'eau. J'étais entourée d'eau. Mon petit village près de Saigon avait des milliers de lacs, d'étangs, de rivières. Pendant la saison des pluies, je marchais les pieds nus sous la pluie, longeant les bords de rivières dans la nuit.
Tôi luôn biết kể từ khi tôi là một cô bé gái. Tôi không biết tại sao. Tôi biết là tôi luôn muốn giúp những người bị đau đớn, những người bị đau khổ. Các trẻ em, cũng như người già, người bệnh. Chăm sóc cho họ, làm vơi đi những khổ cực của họ. Giúp họ hiểu được là ở phía bên kia của sự khổ cực đó mà họ đang cảm nhận với thể xác là những gì to lớn hơn. Ngoài thân xác của chúng ta còn có những gì khác to lớn hơn. Thân thể đơn giản của chúng ta, chúng chỉ là xác thịt mà linh hồn của chúng ta thở xuyên qua.
J'étais une fille malheureuse, toujours triste, qui voulait toujours quelque chose.
Thời đó thật khó khăn, vì chúng tôi ai cũng đều sợ bị trừng phạt, vì chúng tôi là tín đồ Công giáo. Có nhiều lần chúng tôi không dám đi lễ, nhưng chỉ cầu nguyện ở nhà riêng. Có những lúc, khi chúng tôi có một chút can đảm, chúng tôi lại tụ họp bạn bè và cùng nhau đi bộ đến nhà thờ giữa đêm khuya, tay nắm chặt tay. Chúng tôi cảm thấy an toàn hơn khi đi cùng với nhau.
Il a arraché ma robe et je me suis retrouvée nue. C'était ce que je voulais. Je le désirais plus que n'importe quoi. Je ne cessais de le regarder. Le contraire était impossible. Je voulais disparaître dans ce regard jusqu'à m'anéantir.
Okay, I'm going to turn it down while I keep talking. So, under what conditions and by whom does the Vietnamese body, the refugee body, become legible when the history of the camera itself is an instrument of colonial aggression? And how and under what conditions does the body endure and mourn loss when wars do not end, especially when national tropes that construct the U.S. as a benevolent force in equal rights are a political fiction? For Vietnamese refugees in particular, there is a kind of doubling of this paradox of temporality, both in terms of the lived experience of trauma and how refugee subjects are constituted through colonial and imperial discourse. In her book, The Gift of Freedom, I can't see my paper. Okay, there we go, sorry. In her book, The Gift of Freedom, War, Dead, and Other Refugee Passages, Miming Nguyen examines what she calls the refugee condition, critiquing the imperialist mechanisms of war through a political, philosophical concept that she calls, quote, the gift of freedom, a gift given through devastating violence and operating within imperialist narratives. The gift, she argues, has the awesome power to subject, first through the want or absence of those things of which the gift constitutes, and second through the debt that holds the giftee fast, as these powers produce his or her possible desires, movements, and futures. Nguyen critiques the pathologizing diagnoses of refugee trauma as a disorder of temporality, what's considered being, quote, stuck in time, an anthropological discourse that defines entire nations or peoples as existing outside historical time, and so then outside the domain of freedom. Much of my work takes these tropes as a challenge, these temporal tropes. I consider the ways in which the history of the American war in Vietnam, as understood in liberal American empire narratives, denies coevalness in order to contain the racial colonial other to a time other than the present of the modern subject. I often work with materials already marked by time, materials whose existence revolves around contested sites of memory in order to challenge clear distinctions between the authentic and the modern. Working in time-based mediums, I explore tensions explicit in these mediums in relationship to the epistemology bound up with these forms. It's centered on a critical history of media in relationship to empire, interrogating conventions of looking and hearing that are structured by tools that are inextricable from a history of violence. I'm compelled by the archive because it's the most significant way in which historical knowledge and memory are collected, stored, and recovered. It's a site previously understood as neutral and transparent, a simple record of history. The archive and its appropriation challenges the contours of truth and fiction because archival images cannot escape the mark of history. They are signifiers of themselves. The double is both truth and fiction, document and unreliable evidence. This project that we're seeing here began as a photo project where I was photographing Catholic convents in northern Vietnam and doing interviews with nuns. After completing the interviews in Vietnam, I began looking at documentary footage from that time. And I was compelled by two scenes in the footage, the image of the boys making the sign of the cross and the woman turning her back. These two images became the basis for this particular piece. Formerly, I wanted to look at these films as a series of stills, a kind of photographic approach to the moving image, but also based on this idea of disinterring from history's grand narrative, these nameless individuals who will never be known apart from these brief eruptions as fragments of intimate evidence assembled at the foundation of dominant colonial histories. These two images exquisitely evoke the Du Boisian concept of double consciousness, but I wanted to go further, mirroring the two frames that they stared at each other so that the frame seemed split, framed within another framed, as if the viewer were watching the film through a scopic device, always aware of manipulation at hand. I split the two female voices, treat them in some ways as the same but fractured subjectivity splintered from the same historical circumstance. The two voices evoking different instances of becoming, by asking, who is I in the face of trauma, the fracturing implicit in that, speaking that I, playing out the fantasy of the first world and the fantasy of the third world. Using archival Okay. Using archival footage is also wresting a subjectivity from these images. I engage with the tropes of trauma, but also push up against those tropes. Splitting the two voices engaged in the present under conditions of colonialism is a violence that's produced and lived from within. These are not the narratives that the images implicitly tell. The camera and the reality it purports to document then are undoubtedly reliable. But even in its unreliability, there still remains an enduring, even insistent demand of the image to claim a kind of truth, to serve as a witness to history. If this is the case then, what kinds of images should be made? And perhaps, most importantly, how do we radically shift the way in which we perceive these images? I'm interested in this problematic, that even as the camera, as unreliable as it is, serves as a witness, how can we actually produce images that might intervene upon the conventions of looking that typically shut down radical ways of seeing? How might we produce images that nurture ways of seeing that exceed the limits of the apparatus and open up possibilities of transformation? Okay, sorry. Just a couple more images from that. And this was the installation of the video piece. So the next project I want to show quickly is a project that I've created with my longtime collaborator, Hong-Ân. The project pairs photographs of our mothers found in our own family archives for the first few years of our lives in the U.S. and juxtaposes them with excerpts from U.S. congressional hearings in the 1970s that discussed Vietnamese refugees. The work was made in 2017 in the midst of the Syrian refugee crisis. We wanted these images to point to the way in which nations frame humanitarian causes in interrelated racial, cultural, and economic terms, a project cast in stark relief to the virulent anti-immigration policies and anti-refugee sentiments intensifying in the Trump era. In moments such as these, the larger identity of the nation is always at stake, and its precarious logic of inclusion and belonging is contested. We alternate family photographs with excerpts from congressional hearings to show concretely how the nation was framing people like our families, more specifically how our bodies were being understood in economic terms of labor and resources. The juxtaposition also forces the viewer to confront these everyday images of Vietnamese people in the banal and familiar language of vernacular family photography and contend with their own misrecognition of these bodies. In our contemporary moment in which violent ideologies have always undergirded our society are violently erupting throughout everyday American life, we felt a need to assert these images of our families, to claim them as part of a national diasporic narrative in the face of the cancerous myths of exclusionary whiteness that perpetuate American nativism. So this work questions what is missing. What becomes legible within a culture that controls its narrative so tightly in order to perpetuate white supremacy? Growing up in the U.S. as refugees, we were taught to be ashamed of our upbringing, our experiences being non-white, working class, speaking another language at home. All of these things were not valued. To address the reality that Asian American identities have very little to no currency in our contemporary culture, we wanted to create this project that in and by itself was making visible a material legacy. This concept is also reflected in the title of the work. The opposite of looking is not invisibility. The opposite of yellow is not gold. U.S. identity is often defined against a chosen enemy of the historical moment. We're not this, we're this. So we were thinking about the negation and the way that negation is used in establishing power and identity. So as with other projects, this work attempts to destabilize the viewer's position simply looking. What is legible is not about exposure or visibility, but rather about subjectivity. I'm interested in how visual practices can challenge regimes of looking within a racist system in order to foster positions that allow audiences to experience empathy and solidarity that is bound up with resistance, that opens up spaces for contestation. So each of the photographs, it's a photograph from my family archive and then from Hong's family, and they're all pictures of our mothers. And then these two photographs of family albums that are quite large, much larger than the other ones. Okay. So I'm going to talk quickly also about this project that is currently also in process called We Are Beside Ourselves. So I'm just going to do a quick time check. Okay. I began this project in 2018. This is an installation of where it's at right now, which was at the Rubber Factory in the Lower East Side. Mining archives of what seems to be the familiar history of the 1960s and 70s radical liberation movements, this project attempts to make legible a political genealogy that frames the intertwined relationships between the individual and the collective, the personal and the political. Using unfamiliar yet familiarly composed photographs from various archives, this project forges a material history for Asian American resistance, a history that frames the visualization of political identities in photographic terms of the legible. What is unseen? What has been refused to be acknowledged? This project suggests the powerful intimacies and political positions and attempts to cultivate a historical archive of solidarity. So I'm going to kind of go quickly. So this is a photograph of Asian American women that were involved in Gidra, which was the newspaper that was started by UCLA students in 1969. They tried to get funding from UCLA, but they were refused, and so they started the magazine off-site. And actually, they just started reprinting, like literally like last month. So they've just like began their project. But this was on an issue. This was a photograph of the staffers that was then that was used in a magazine in an issue that was about was kind of like a feminist issue about like women's about the sexualization of women and Asian women's bodies. So the photograph right now, the project exists as a series of carbon transfer photographs on mirror, and so they're printed on mirror and then framed with a mirror that reflects it. And essentially, the work right now is kind of looking at different archives and thinking about these different moments of intimacies between cross-racial organizing and these occluded moments in history that that may seem familiar but are totally unknown kind of historical narrative. So this was a major protest in Chinatown in 1972 against police brutality, taken by a very well-known photographer in the Asian American community, Corky Lee, who still lives in Chinatown, and he has been involved in some of the research that I've been doing. So you can kind of see how the mirror reflects back. This is a photograph of Yuri Kochiyama, who is an activist and also aligned with Malcolm X's organization, and she was actually the person who held Malcolm X as he lay dying, which is a photograph that was published in Life magazine on the spread on his assassination, but it's a history that was occluded in many mainstream narratives. A lot of people, like for example, Spike Lee's movie replaced her with Betty Shabazz, his wife. So I'm looking at these different moments of intimacies across these political solidarities to try to reveal and trouble the narratives that we've inherited, to kind of rethink how we are considering our moment of kind of identity politics and our solidarities across communities. This is another one that was an anti-war protest that was in LA, and it was all Asian American students, and this beautiful, it's kind of hard the images are quite hard to photograph because obviously it's a mirror, and it's also carbon transfer, so it's like gelatin on the mirror, so it kind of has like a kind of sculptural quality. It kind of is raised off the mirror. But this photograph where, this couple, they're holding hands, and it's like two young Asian Americans. And so trying to think about these sort of intimate moments and these images that we don't see oftentimes in mainstream narrative, which is like Asian American, love, essentially, right? And another image, these are young teenagers from an Oakland high school that was protesting the murder of Bobby Hutton, an activist in Oakland. And then a series of lithographs that I reprinted, all of these posters that were printed during this era that was modeled after the Black Panther movement of their party platform and program. So this kind of model was taken up by many organizations in the U.S., but also across the Third World Liberation Movement. So I'm still doing research and trying to find some of these original posters. I War Quen was a radical communist group that came out of New York and then later had a chapter in LA. The Young Lords, of course, which was started in Chicago. And then the White Panther Party, which is interesting. When people see this, they kind of freak out because they think it's like white power. But it was a radical white group that was started in Michigan, that was active in Detroit and other cities. And then there's also a sound piece, which I can't really get into because but Len Gun, it's called Len Gun, which is a phrase in Vietnamese that's very hard to translate, but this is kind of all of the translations that I got. It kind of is both like a physical, but also emotional, but also like literal kind of thing. So this project is really current. I'm in the middle of research. So this exhibition happened, but I'm still working on the project and doing a bunch more research in California right now at Berkeley and at San Francisco State and LA. So I'll be working on this pretty intensely in the next 6 months. So I feel like I'm out of time.
Just play just a few seconds.
Okay, so I was going to talk a little bit about some of the sound work that I've been doing that is a part of my practice, and I think a lot about sound and how it's disciplining as a sort of element that's both, sound is something that's physical, that's like kind of emotional versus like more perspectival. That's vision is kind of perspectival, sound is kind of non-perspectival, is more bodily. And I've worked on several sound pieces. This being one of them, and I'll just play this for a minute. This is like a piece that has been both an indoor installation and an outdoor installation. So this is Vietnamese Catholic chanting, and
don't you want somebody to love? Don't you need somebody to love? Wouldn't you love somebody to love? You better find somebody.
A cappella version of one of the most famous songs during the Vietnam War, the American War in Vietnam. And then this is French Legionnaire soldiers singing a marching song. So this installation is modeled after a very common street scene in Vietnam, which is crazy wires, like very kind of uneven. You think about like the unevenness of development in Vietnam and the infrastructure. Lots of wires are just hanging out everywhere. And these speakers were installed during French colonialism in the early 1950s to basically speak to soldiers, to speak to the subjects. So it's kind of this sort of sound meditation that uses different sounds and thinking about the collective, the collective sonic space, right? How does one, get interpolated by sound and become a subject, right? What is the kind of thing that draws it together? So I'm interested in sound and thinking about it being this bodily, it already assumed to be subjective rather than objective, something that's immersive rather than perspectival, and about physical contact versus surfaces. And I'm going to play just like a little bit of audio from a piece that I did just this past fall, which is also still, I'm going to rework it. It's a piece that was shown at 12 Gates, curated by two curators in the room, Josh and Natasha, and maybe Shimmer's here. No,
Natasha's here.
Oh, and
no, Shimmery couldn't.
Okay, but anyway, and I worked on this piece for the show at 12 Gates, and it's let me see if I can pull up the image really quickly, and then I'll play just a second of the song, a second of the audio.
Oops, it's doing it again.
Oh, sorry.
And
How do I do? Oh, wait, sorry. There we go. Okay. Okay, so the piece is all the way in the back. It's just this metal sculpture with two little transistor radios and a photograph printed on silk. And then I'm going to show, I'll play the audio. Just do with it. Oh, here it is. So.
How are you, G.I. Joe? It seems to me that most of you are poorly informed about the going of the war, to say nothing about a correct explanation of your presence over here. Nothing is more confused than to be ordered into a war, to die, or to be maimed for life, without the faintest idea of what's going on. Isn't it clear that the war makers are gambling with your lives while pocketing huge profits?
This is Hanoi Hannah, who was a very well-known radio announcer for Radio Vietnam, and would speak to American soldiers and kind of basically compel them to abandon bear me. So it's a work in progress that I'm still thinking about. That's going to be a larger project about sound and war. So the sonic and war. That's it.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to be here, especially I think we're kind of doing a Korean pani, a kimchi pani, because I'm in the middle of these two amazing Vietnamese American artists, which I also know from the University of California, Irvine, and we're all dragons, by the way. So before I discuss my current project, oh wait, could I get some water? That'd be great. Before I discuss the current project, which is called Wunderkammer and Things, I just want to bring up a quote. Oh, thank you so much. I'm very thirsty. I want to show you this quotation that I often go to when I'm feeling anxious or vulnerable about the state of the world. And I've been living and working outside of the US for over a decade, and I always get terrified when I come back to the US. So this is what I have in my studio, a revolution that is based on the people exercising their creativity in the midst of devastation is one of the greatest historical contributions of humankind. And Grace Lee Boggs, I knew her when I graduated from high school. And when I lived in Detroit as a young college student, I also worked with her on a project called Detroit Asian Youth with Detroit Summer. And I always thought that I wanted to be present like she was. I was very inspired by her relentless optimism and her generosity. And so that given that, I think that we should all, try not to be paralyzed in these moments and to just continue to make art and to enjoy art. So now I'm going to turn to my project. I call Wunderkammer and Things a part sculptural installation. I'm sorry, this is right in my face. This light. It's a part sculptural installation, a part mini museum, and most importantly, a reflection on my migratory history. It is very much influenced by my Korean and German heritage and my American upbringing, and it spans research across these cultures. And I've been engaging with the reassessment of and the post-colonial discourses surrounding ethnographic and non-Western collections and the archaeological archive. I'm very interested in concepts around cultural acquisition and appropriation. And it's I call it a transcultural and heterogeneous project. So this image right here, Wunderkammer, let me just let you know, is a German word that means cabinet of curiosities. There's a couple other words that you might also hear. Cabinets of wonder, that would be, there's also Kunstkammer, which is art chamber, or Kunstkabinet, or Schatzkammer, which is treasure chamber. And this particular engraving is probably the most famous collection. This is the 17th century collection of Ole Worm, who was a Danish physician. And his collection contained hundreds of natural history items that were carefully arranged in his own room at home. And it was later, at his death, it was subsumed by the Danish Royal Kunstkammer. So emerging in 16th century Europe, the earliest pictorial depiction of the Kunstkammer is this one from 1599. It was published as an engraving in a catalog by Ferrante Imperato. And this was his personal collection, based on his personal collection. He was a pharmacist of his time, and he really concentrated, again, on this idea of natural history research. And Wunderkammer represented quasi-scientific knowledge of the other and the exotic. And the original creators of these cabinets were of noble and scholarly class, so they often amassed their riches through imperialism. So instead of having a European prince or some type of stately patriarch at the helm, my Wunderkammer, or my cabinet of curiosities, will be based off of my life and my personal history. And I'll also create an additional component where the public will be able to contribute to a Wunderkammer of the people. But in this matter of historical and colonial Wunderkammer, I'm embarking on a collection of extraordinary objects, which of course I will attempt to categorize and tell stories about the wonders and oddities of the cosmos. And of course, I'm going to try to reflect the sum of knowledge about the world, and it will serve, for this desire to find the so-called universal knowledge in this small little mini museum. So collecting practices were first recorded in Europe during the 16th century, but during the 17th and the 18th century, this fervent interest in collecting is quite evident in images from Qing China and the Joseon Korea. And so my project will underscore this transnational movement of the Wunderkammer. It's really evident in Korean paintings of the Joseon dynasty that there was some type of contact with Europe or the West, but because Koreans actually didn't have any direct contact with Europe until the late 19th century, it must have really been through China. And so I'm tracing these visible influences through Chinese display furniture. These would be display furnitures for the Chinese treasure box, or the dobagui. And there's obvious Chinese and Western influence on Korean collecting and painting practices, and I really want to reflect that in my work. So this is, the influence you can really see are evident in these pictorial depictions of collections in these munbangdo paintings, where you can see asymmetrical shelving and this illusionistic technique, which alludes to this Western perspective, was employed. And these paintings often held objects that had supposedly not yet reached Korea, such as, glasses and clocks. And so this is one such object that could have been just on display in one of these munbangdo paintings. This is a very exotic equation clock from Germany from 1951, and it's currently on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in this exhibition called Making Marvel, Science and Splendor at the Courts of Europe. And I'm actually here in town to carefully examine the collection and to attend a symposium about it this month. And the curator, his name is Wolfgang Köppe, and he's originally from Germany. So these Korean paintings, which I called munbangdo, they're also referred to as well as 책거리, which means in English, books and things. And we can really see that this is the beginning of a still life painting genre. So it heavily features books. So Koreans, they like to depict themselves as scholars. And often these paintings portrayed books that the collector, the person who commissioned the painting, didn't actually own, but they aspired to own. And so here's my aspiration. I'd actually like to own these books instead of just reading them at the library. And my other aspiration is the first book, which is by Horst Bredekamp, which is Antique Nostalgia and Machine and Belief in Machines, the history of the art chamber and the future of art history. I'd really like to be able to read that fluently. So I'm like completely fluent in broken German, but my academic abilities have not allowed me to read this book quite the way I want to. So I refer to 책거리 in my title, the Wunderkammer and Things, as I said, and my planned installation will consist of 90 plus objects. Some of them will be found material, some of them I'll create myself. And they'll be curated by me, and they'll be put into these chambers that will be I'll also employ this tiered shelving and asymmetrical compartments. So I'm going to allude to this transnational Chinese influence. And so I want to create, as I said, this Wunderkammer based on my own idiosyncratic history and my experiences, develop, again, the public component of the Wunderkammer, and then I'd like to create a type of educational program that really looks at the explosion of collecting and displaying of these curiosities in 17th century Joseon, and then link it back to all these transnational influences as a kind of Wunderkammer precursor to the museum. So what I'm going to do now is just show the work that led me to come to this project, because this is a new project that I've just started in October. And these are objects that I like to call transcultural artifacts. This one is the first one called, it's heterogeneous infiltration for Sogo. This work really, I would say, marks a shift in my practice when I started really using handicraft in the work. And it was in a show called I Like Korea and Korea Likes Me, which took place at the Korean Cultural Center in Berlin, 2018. And looking back at this work now, I think it functions as a kind of totem or self-portrait that reflects on my transnational identity. And I made the pieces by crocheting a wool yarn, and then I went through this really demanding process of turning them into felt. which becomes really part of the work, this transformation. And then there's an obvious visual and psychological connection to the work of iconic artist Joseph Beuys, with his works where he covered different types of musical instruments and felt. And he also had a show in New York that was called I Like America and America Likes Me. Okay. This is the second one that I did after that. So it's another traditional Korean drum. I've learned both of these drums during my journey to search for my identity. And on each side of the drum, you see some very provocative symbols that are really somewhat troublesome in terms of German identity on differing levels. And this is a next piece that will show you what those symbols look like. This is a newer piece, but I use the same symbols on that last piece. This work, Women Warrior Shields, I'm going to read quickly just a short part of the text that I utilize in exhibitions, and these texts often hang quite conspicuously next to the work, very similar to what you might find at an ethnographic museum. So this is, for example, what it might look like. A symbol of well-being and good luck, the swastika can be found in artifacts of ancient societies in India, China, Africa, and Europe. This is a symbol of divinity and spirituality in India and East Asian religions, which appeared as early as 7,000 years ago in Eurasia. A sacred symbol in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Odinism, it is an ubiquitous sight on temples or houses in India, Indonesia, and South Korea. The symbol is used by both Korean Buddhism and Korean shamanism. The author of this text was not aware of the true story of the swastika until she returned to Korea, being raised with only a narrow Eurocentric and US hegemonic point of view. So you can see I'm always inserting myself as the author of this text in my work. And I showed Die Schamanen, which was the piece, the chango piece with the drums, which means the female shaman. I often show in tandem with other pieces. So this is an ongoing installation called The Seven Sisters. And this ongoing installation really explores this trope of maidens in distress who must flee from danger. And I'm actually really interested in these cultural stories where the maidens have to flee, but then on their way to fleeing, they often get transformed or they metamorphose into something else. And the title references the Pleiades, also known as the Seven Sisters, this cluster of stars located in the constellation of Taurus. So the installation of the Seven Sisters is meant to be an installation, a memorial installation for women, and women specifically who have been oppressed, sexually abused, or discriminated against based on their gender. Women like me, abandoned for being female, women like Chanel Miller, Christine Blasey Ford, and Anita Hill, who have spoken out against their sexual predators. Women like the comfort women who were forced into sexual slavery during the Second World War at the time of Japanese occupation. And really the work I dedicate this work to women who speak out, who are brave enough to speak out. And I consider actually the Korean comfort women to be the true beginning of the Me Too movement. When the first grandmother, Kim Hak-sun, she spoke about her experiences being sexually enslaved in 1991. So this is the most ambitious installation of this work. It's called Seven Sisters and the Lost Daughter. And this fourth iteration contains 13 bamboo wives with a white screen in the shape of a half moon. And so I'm just going to discuss briefly the materials that I'm using in this work. They're East Asian inventions. The first, as I said, bamboo wife. It's a traditional tool which also appeared in many other Southeast and East Asian countries. And it's a hollow bamboo bolster that's approximately the size of a human body. And when it's hot out, you are supposed to embrace it when you sleep. And it should allow cool breezes to circulate within the bamboo pillow, and hopefully then you'll cool down. And I just find it really quite revealing that this useful object, supposedly to service a male, was conflated with the idea of a wife or a woman. And then you see these bamboo wives, what I've done is fitted them with this extended sports visor, which is also developed in South Korea and very popular in Asia and in the Asian diaspora, with female consumers seeking to protect their skin against the damaging effects of the sun. And I think they've really become kind of a symbol for the pursuit of the ideal beauty. So as I mentioned in the work, sorry, I need to go back really quick. We find 7 but not 13 objects. I wanted to just explain that a little bit. So 7 represents the first original sisters, and then my thought was there's this parallel universe where one of them, which is called the Lost Pleiad, tragically disappears. And this lost daughter really evokes the fate of various missing girls and women in the world, including those who suffer by various forms of gender violence. So the Boko Haram Nigerian kidnapping, East European sex trafficking, kidnapped and murdered indigenous women, South Asian child marriage, and the Hmong bride kidnapping, and the Korean preference of sons, which I am a survivor of. So even though I'm really alluding to sexual violence and gender oppression, I always include in my work a reparative gesture, and I really want to focus on this process of transformation and hope through the usage of my materials. This one is called Seven Sisters and the Lotus Flower. It's the last iteration that I created during summer residence at the Incheon Art Platform, and I considered the composition to be a kind of critical aesthetic turning point in the work. So instead of hanging the sisters separately, they're bound together now in a pattern. And what they reference are these lotus design flowers that you can see on the sides of the Buddhist temple, architectural elements. And you are able to see that when you get up really close and you look into the mirror. Okay, so I'm going to end with this piece. This is a work called There's No Place Like Korea. And it's a separate object that I often include in different iterations of the work, like to mix and match them in new idiosyncratic compositions. So these are common Korean rubber slippers that I painted and transformed into magical slippers as a kind of present to all the female figures in my work, fictional and real. And it references, of course, the pair that Dorothy wore in The Wizard of Oz that protected her and eventually transported her back to her home and family. And I wish that same safe space to all women and the possibility to return. And then I'm going to leave you with my last image. So this is an example of the research that I'm doing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art during this project. And it's this Orientalist ceramic painting that I photographed that imagines the everyday life of the Far East from a German perspective. It's from circa 1725. It was produced in Meissen, which is a very popular city for ceramics. It's probably like I think it's the porcelain city in Germany. So it's portraying these so-called Chinese and exotic clothing in these settings. And at that time, since they probably never encountered an Asian person, it has like no basis in reality, and it's really just fulfilling their imagination of the other. And I hope to be able to reflect on these types of imaginings in my Wunderkammer. And one special thing I want to say, I just want to give special thanks to the Owl Foundation because they're supporting this project. I want to also thank the curator from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Eleanor Sua-hyun, and thank Alexander Chang, who's going to be curating the show in a solo exhibition at Rutgers University in 2021, so stay tuned for that. And the last thank you I do have to say is the Berlin Senat Department of Europe and Culture, they funded me to come here. So I just want to give a thanks to them as well. So thank you so much.
So echoing the thanks, I again want to thank Asian Archive in America, and then Hillary, CC, Jane, and of course all of you. I'm going to talk for 6 minutes, literally, and because I'm aware of the time, but I'm just going to show you segments of video trilogy I completed, and I'm working on a new feature film, which is around the same themes. These are just some installation and gallery shots of how they exist, and also their performance artists that are part of it. And this you can see online on YouTube.
I hear your heartbeat next to mine. A storyteller told me that love is so blind. You got me tossing and turning for your love, and I'm yearning. These haters, they never knowing what we got is so real. Your sex appeal, serious, baby, you got me curious. Sometimes you're furious, kiss and make up. I miss you. Time flies staring at bang bang, anh đã ra đi bang bang, em sẽ bơ vơ bang bang, tiếng súng khi xưa bang bang, ta sẽ không quên bao giờ.
So these are just short excerpts from these longer videos, but you can Google Việt Lê Sexperimental or Love Bang, and that's online. So these are how they exist. The second one is a collaboration. So the first one was a trilingual, time-traveling trans love triangle in Cambodian, Vietnamese, and English rap song, which I wrote. This is a collaboration with Dai Lam Ling, an experimental band in Hanoi. So in the end of the video, the lyrics which are translated Anh đừng xa nữa, em bỏ tất cả, em quên tất cả, and they roughly translate as don't be distant, I give up everything, I forget everything. Forget my name, forget my age, forget the path. So on one level, when I was a boat refugee, or let's say you broke up with someone and are heartbroken, you would want to do anything to get them back. And of course, you may not be able to get back your lost country. But on another level, I also thought about forgetting and loss through Eastern or Southeast Asian Buddhist framework, in which if you lose your sense of self, lose and forget your name intentionally, that's also a different way to think about loss as possibly liberation. So I was thinking about these two poles. And the last one, also thinking about refugees, but refugees then and now. As I said, I was a boat refugee, and we ended up in Thailand for 6 months. I had a solo show in Bangkok, but I made this around the height of the quote-unquote Syrian refugee crisis, but also thinking about North African refugees and that liminal space in the camp. So this is actually in a closed-down boy bar, which I imagined or reimagined as a refugee camp. And this is some of the background in the video, and these are just some of the archival images, which is in the video itself that I'll just play you. And this is an installation off of Felix Gonzalez Torres that you see in the longer video. I'll just play you a quick clip, which tries to put the camp in refugee camp.
But we certainly want to have conversation around this, and I know there's going to be a huge number of questions and feelings and comments about what everybody has just seen. So why don't we just open it up, and as everybody knows who's been here before, I'll just call on you if nobody says anything. You tell me. Tommy's in the back row. How do you react? How do you feel about this?
I wanted to know how the three of you come together, and also where the title comes from.
Yeah, come on. Sex in the Cité, or citing archival intimacies and empires.
So as a Vietnamese person, Hồng-Ân may know this, we love bad puns. I thought about New York, but I also thought about the French colonial empire and thinking through the city, what is the city, also thinking through archives, which runs through our work, and then during the process, I don't know if you want to talk more about it, how we came collaboratively with the presentation and the formats, and thinking about our threads that we had in common.
Yeah, I think both Viet and I we have had a long conversations over the years. We've known each other for a long time and working in and around some of the same themes around post-colonial kind of critique of thinking about war and Asia and Vietnam. And yeah, the title was your brilliant idea. And to me, I'd never really thought of, I kind of, thinking about that word intimacy and archival intimacies was really provocative to me, to kind of draw out, thinking about actual bodies in archives and how they're viewed, and the kind of both physical but also, more conceptual kind of connection between subjects, right? Either physical and or historical. So it felt like a really interesting framework for the way that I work with archive in the histories that I engage with. So yeah. And Kate was brought on as a third person to kind of round out the panel. But you guys had that conversation before me. Yeah.
Any other themes you see?
Another question? X?
Can you just talk more about the first performance? It was fantastic. Was it your work, or what was it?
I like to work collaboratively. So the White Gaze is actually a collaboration with Michelle Dizon and I. And then I was invited by Faith Wilding, a performance artist, to do a performance extension of Waiting. And she has a piece called Waiting With, which is about solidarity. And so we extended it. And of course, Kate and I have, I think through your collaborative efforts, really re-envisioned the piece. So, and then, but back to the first question about intimacy, I was also thinking about, for all of us, this idea of intimacy of four continents in terms of Lisa Lowe, and that structurally these structures of oppression or violence are actually connected through empire that we're all complicit in. And I think the Wunderkammer things in the West and the East, and yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I guess that's it.
The words that you asked us to speak, I assume they're all mine. Wasn't familiar with Tamaulipas. I assume that's an island somewhere, because all the rest seem to be islands.
Yes. So this book, when Michelle, who's not here, asked me to collaborate, she basically excised the text from National Geographic, and I didn't actually understand why there are certain images with certain texts, and then I learned through the process of research that these were these U.S. Territorial possessions, and so we have about, or had about 50.
Interesting.
The performances, every time we do it, it's quite different. I came in, I thought of myself, I'm just a vessel for Viet's kind of concept or work, but as we've been working on it together, I think this is the fourth iteration that we've done. I feel like I'm becoming a part of piece in a very distinct way. So
it was also your idea to have the audience read the territories. Yeah.
And what is the title?
Oh, it's just called White Gaze or National Geographic. Thinking about this pornography of graphic or invisible images.
Yes. Other questions? I am going to call on somebody, so.
It's like school.
Yes, over here.
My question is for Viet and Hồng-Ân. I had a really visceral and intellectual experience looking at your work because, and I think part of it is because I was engaging with the images, but I also understood Vietnamese. I have a question about how you embrace audiences who don't share the language, and what kinds of conversations do you engage with them, and what kind of conversations do you wish you had more of?
That's a great question. Well, thank you for the question and your response. I think that, I mean, as you notice, like, I don't translate everything. It's oftentimes in my work, and it's an intentional move to call attention to our different subject positions in our relationship to language. And I want to make a space for people who know Vietnamese in the diaspora and in Vietnam. And so to me, it's a really unique and awesome and really meaningful thing that you can understand that, and not everybody can. And it's not trying to be exclusionary, but it's to call out difference and to for us to be able to sit with that difference and to recognize when we don't understand, what does that mean to not understand, why don't we understand, and then intentionally to call attention to the image, and then you're contending with what you might not know, because when you don't understand something auditorily and then you think that you understand visually, then you start to question, do I actually really know what I understand visually? So it's kind of a way to basically call attention to that discomfort of not knowing and understanding our already presupposed, our position of like basically destabilizing what we think we know about what we're seeing and kind of playing with that back and forth. And so, yeah, so there's kind of two things. One, I want to make a space for people who understand Vietnamese, so there's kind of like a very, the work has been called aggressive. I've had people, who wanted to show the work and have like then, and asked me to subtitle, and I say no, and it's been pulled. So that's a perfectly legitimate response in the sense that that is kind of also interesting response, in terms of like how people feel about that discomfort of not knowing everything, So so for me it's really like understanding the kind of transnational sense of the work, and that our positions are slippery where we are and who we speak to and how we speak to each other. So the conversations have been hard, but I feel like I've had a lot of people have that response when there's Vietnamese and, they realize there's not a translation. And so there's this thing of like, oh, I understand that, but probably nobody else does. And I think that's a really important part of the work.
Where do these clips come from? Because I understand the French.
Yes, yeah.
So it was interesting.
Exactly,
thinking,
and so that's the other thing
what
too, is the French. So that was an interesting. That was also obviously intentional because the French is not translated as well, and I don't speak French, so I translate. So it's a script that I wrote, and it's three. So so the audio are three actors. Two actors speaking the parts. So it's kind of this fictional narrative that's kind of narrativizing the sort of like the story behind the images, right, of what we're seeing. So it's intentional for that reason too. So, and when I listen to it now, actually, some of the French is lost on me. Obviously I wrote it originally, but it's been so long now, sometimes I'm just sort of lost in the voice and kind of pick out some things, but I oftentimes have to go back to the original script to remember what I wrote and what it says.
And did you ask a Vietnamese to speak the French?
No, it's a white French person who spoke the French. So they were specifically a French white colonial person and a Vietnamese colonial subject kind of characters. Yeah.
Thanks, Tammy, for your question. I don't translate my Cambodian rap song or the Vietnamese cover, which is Nhạc Vàng, and you have some golden music. I saw one of her videos, and this, I was crying because there's something about this translation or this mistranslation, and I'm also very interested in the circuits of transnational Asian popular culture intentionally in terms of, let's say, hip hop in Cambodia or Vietnam, which references or doesn't reference Britney Spears or K-pop, and the semiotic lag and lapse and this positionality that we all occupy in terms of not being in between, or it's intentional kind of. Some people will understand it. For instance, in Cambodia, they think it's a real hit Cambodian rap song, and I like that. And so, thinking about audiences and privilege and language.
I'm interested to know how have these works been received in Vietnam? Have they been?
Yeah.
Have you been able to show them?
Cecily works for Asia Cultural Council,
Okay.
so she's very interested in cultural exchange.
Well, I have to say that every time that my work has tried to be presented, it's been denied by the cultural police. So all of the events I've done in Vietnam have been underground.
Sure.
And so, I mean, I've had, I have I have a lot of friends and people that I've met in Vietnam, and there's like a really strong, beautiful diasporic community. But that's really the audience. It's not wider than that, unfortunately, because it's never been shown in any legitimate way. But I think things are changing, and it depends, but I think that this work, the work about the war, is still very sensitive, and it's the narratives are not something that I think are there. It makes it too vulnerable, I think. I don't really know, but it's just never. It's
also it's a foreign narrative because it's about the refugee experience, about a very particular diasporic experience that isn't really accessible to a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm just sort of wondering about.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, because I feel like dealing with the refugee, the continued refugee kind of narrative is still incredibly sensitive, and that we have friends, who were artists in the diaspora who based in Vietnam who have had lots and lots of ongoing trouble. So dealing with that topic, even just refugees, so.
But also Vietnamese artists, sometimes local artists, and I really question the distinction between local and diasporic, when they have public events that the censors don't have. We both come back to Vietnam quite often, then we just make it a private party, and then there are other ways through other institutions. But the second video and the last video I worked with, so the second video was basically, for me, a who's who in the performance and contemporary art world in Vietnam, and Da Ngoc Da is a very famous composer, and of course the dancer with the bald head is actually quite well known.
Who is the dancer with the bald head? He's also
Duy Nguyen. So he was just performing in Saigon, but he travels globally. He was originally trained as a self-trained as a hip-hop dancer, and then he later studied contemporary dance, and so I basically view that as a collaboration with these artists in Vietnam, thinking about these keywords, and so the last one as well, thinking with Southeast Asian, particularly Thai and Vietnamese artists. So my strategy, and other artists I've seen, to think through how do we deal with these problematic or contested histories, and oftentimes other artists may not overtly deal with the traumas of war or the traumas of rapid modernization, or maybe they get actually a lot of international recognition because they deal with the Vietnam Wars or the wars in Southeast Asia, but there are many other strategies of being in between.
Any other? Jen, do you have a comment?
I have so many.
Pick one. You can think about it. You can pick one. I'll go into someone else.
I work as an archivist and for like private collectors, and something that really something that feels really compelling about tonight's presentation, especially dealing with archive, is the word intimacy and like the kind of troubled feeling it brings up in me. To give a little bit of context, I spend a lot of time with objects and also images, and something that I think unites your work is also this like when the archive is kind of like troubled and mediated by like a Western gaze, then how do you reconcile beauty with like a sense of dishonor and also like like conquest and possession in a very problematic way. And I'm just curious if you can speak a little bit about like your own, how do you build intimacy with the archives that you encounter in your research process, and how do you then like try to address or subvert, like can you just talk about that process of just spending time with those objects?
Okay, so my work came out of my own precious collection, things that I had collected specifically from Korea, things that I found to be fascinating, or I didn't, they seemed to be other for me because I didn't grow up necessarily with them. And, I want to go back also to this idea of like untranslatability in the work, because it's something that I also really struggle with, because most of the time I'm producing and I'm exhibiting for a European audience. That's mostly where I'm showing and producing, creating these pieces. And I started, of course, making these textual parts of, to try to explain what some of these symbolic references were. And it really came from my experience with how much do I want to tell about the symbol or this particular object from, either my own archive or something that I've seen at a museum. And I think one of the things that sort of pushed me to consider telling a bit more was when I would talk to other older Koreans who had no idea what some of these objects are. Like, I had these conversations with Koreans that had left. They've almost forgotten like what this bamboo wife is. Even specifically my father-in-law, when I showed him my work, he was just like totally floored. He was like, had no idea. He'd never, or maybe he'd forgotten what it was. I think he had seen it, or somebody had used it, but he had forgotten. And it sort of just exists at the folk museum, for example. And there isn't this sort of everyday relationship that people have with this object that they had from before. And so dealing with like this sort of things that I sort of expected people to just completely understand from a Korean context, and them not understanding what it was, then pushed me to start thinking about, well, how do I contextualize it even for the Korean viewers and the overseas Korean viewers who had never come into contact with these objects. But it's difficult, I mean, for sure, because, majority of people who are looking at my work are Europeans, and I'm not sure. I mean, I'd love to hear, feedback about how that comes across, for example, much more like multicultural, audience. Maybe in a way it's feeding, I don't know, people's maybe expectations, or maybe there needs to be, maybe I need to put more mystery into the usages of the objects, but it's something that I'm really considering every time in every single institution that I show these pieces at.
Yeah, I mean, working in the archive is, I think when I first started really, using the archive in my work when I was much younger, it really was this process. And you'll hear people from the diaspora say this, it's like looking for yourself, and so it's a very intimate experience. I mean, looking at Vietnamese archives of like the war, it's like, am I gonna run across my mom's or my dad's face and my sister's, So there's both like a fear and a desire to want to see myself, and so it is very intimate for when the archive is dealing with your own personal history, But I think also just other archives that I've worked with, there's also, I feel like, it is a very intimate experience. Like for me, it's like, it is like trying to find a relationship with these people that I don't know much about, like these, again, nameless people who are documented and sort of like trying to imagine the story around it. So, I think I had not, again, thought of this word intimacy, but it does describe really well, like how our relationship with the archive, it animates it in a way that then becomes a relationship with both the object and also the subjects,
I think of intimacy, vulnerability, and imagination as sites of political struggle, but also possibility. So the archive is embodied, is a visceral thing, but of course, as Derrida writes, also a problematic structural site. And I often think of Claudia Rankine when she talks about, in Citizen, in interviews around it, where we only think about racialized violence or structural violence when it's a scandal. We don't really talk about it when it's on everyday intimate, right? And it is on the level of the everyday and the intimate that we enact these larger structures. And so how do we really think through intimacy, structural violence, structural oppression? How do we change it through vulnerability, through imagination? I think sexuality is something that occurs in all our work, and to actually embrace, vulnerability and mourning and melancholia as sites of real political resistance, and that we're creating or remixing or interrupting the archive and building our own.
I was just gonna say too, I feel like in my looking at I'm looking very much at different types of objects in the archive, not so much like photographs or these types of documents, but for me I think there's kind of this longing for what you talked about, this longing to understand myself. And maybe I just need to give you a little bit of context because I was orphaned and then I was transnationally adopted to the United States very, very young. So in this sort of search for these objects, I'm looking for some type of kinship or familiarity. And so that just really resonated with me, in terms of thinking about these intimate moments, or maybe the intimate moments that I'm trying to create by then employing these objects in my work.
And I guess I just want to quickly add to, I'm sorry I didn't make this super clear, but I was very intrigued by the problematics of intimacy too, that when the physical documentation is how either by the Western gaze or the Western technology, then how do you deal with maybe gaps and silence, and how how do you choose to either amplify or magnify certain aspects that you're propelled to but feel uncomfortable with. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
That's a huge observation, and that's really very interesting. We have time for one more question, if that's okay?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm ready now. No, but it's actually coming off of what you were saying.
Does everybody know who Jen is?
Hi guys, yeah. So it's actually jumping off of your question, actually. And unfortunately, it is actually localized around jumping off of Hong-Un's work, but maybe it can migrate into something for all three of you guys. I hope. I am curious about, with this last body of work that you're still working on, the sublimation of this kind of coalition politics, and what kinds of, and the intimacies of the sublimated coalition politic history. So I'd be curious to know how that is played, what kind of feedback you've gotten from outside of the Asian and Asian American communities, and perhaps whether, given that, or regardless of that, what's the next move in that area? Because I think that that's certainly something that I think about all the time as an Asian American. It's so urgent. So.
That's a good question. I mean, the work is pretty new, and I've just showed it that one time, and so I'm not really sure. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations with different people and have shared the work, and I think it's I think we're in a moment where we need to look at that legacy in a different way, because we're in a kind of crisis, for lack of a better word, of the legacy of the identity politics, and both the kind of moment where we're both there's a kind of parasitism of identity and also kind of a refusal at the same time. And to me, going back to that moment is trying to also one, these narratives are not well known around the coalition, you know what I mean? Some people do. If you study, radical politics, you might know, and you might know more details, and you would know these things, but it's not mainstream knowledge. So, it behooves white supremacy to keep them separate, you know? So to me, it's both about weaving those stories together, but also a part of the project is also connecting it to today's moments. So some of the work is doing some, I'm working on a video that's sort of looking at, I live in North Carolina, and looking at some of the cross-racial organizing around white supremacy and Confederate monuments. So there's going to be a component that's going to be very present. So I'm trying to kind of like, you know, set two in relief next to each other, and also tangentially, but also connected. I'm working on a project at the Wattis Institute around Trim and Ha's work. So I'm in residence there for the next 6 months, and it's that she's their research focus for the year, and so I'm working on a kind of culminating project for their research year. And you know, she's influenced my work. She's influenced a generation of young Asian American artists and thinkers, and she's an interesting figure to me because of both the ways in which, I mean, obviously her thinking around these concepts of speaking nearby, destabilizing subject positions, and the transnational, you know, kind of feminist perspective that she brought so early on. So I'm interested in that theoretical work, but also the fact that she as a figure has been so interestingly elusive in terms of her identity. So I'm kind of like thinking through, like, what is it? I mean, she's a magical person, but she's also been able to, she's like this in-between person who's resisted. She's not Asian American, she's not Vietnamese American, she's not Vietnamese. Like, she's never claimed any of these identities. So I'm really interested in thinking about her as a figure, her legacy, and obviously her intellectual legacy. So I'm trying to weave all those things together to kind of set into relief like our current moment and how we can move forward. So that's not answering your first part, because I'm not really sure where, like, what, you know, the reception in terms of what, you know, how, yeah, but yeah, that's where it's going.
Yeah, any more? I think we've kind of run out of time. Any more responses to that? Thank you guys very, very much. Thank you all for